Hi there, my name is Jenny Steinberg and I'm the owner of Through the Woods Therapy Center. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how we integrate culture and race into the work that we do in therapy. As a white kid raised in the 90s, I was taught that the gold standard for how to interact with and view Black, Indigenous, and people of color was to be colorblind. And that was what I carried with me all the way through my early 20s. So when I was in grad school and I was presented with a different model, a model that views race issues through the lens of privilege and oppression, I was really resistant to it. I remember our cultural issues and counseling professor said to us that if we were working with a client of a different race, what we should do is we should say to that client, hey, I'm aware that you're Black and I'm white, and I'm wondering how that affects your perception of our dynamic, how that affects your comfort level. And I thought to myself, yeah, I am never going to do that. But let me tell you, when I'm working with a client from a different racial background than my own, now I always do that. Because it acknowledges that we have different lived experiences and creates a sense of safety that it's okay to talk about these topics and these differences in therapy. When I'm talking about our practice, sometimes I struggle about how to talk about the way that we work with racial minorities. The dominant phrase in the field is that we are culturally competent. But competence really seems like a baseline requirement, and I would hope that we strive for more than that. The best phrase I've come across is cultural humility, which means that we say, I'm not perfect and I would love to learn. Can you please teach me about your lived experience? I don't know everything about what your life entails. But because cultural humility doesn't mean anything to most people, I usually just borrow a word from the way that I describe how we work with queer people, and I say that we're culturally affirming. Truthfully though, cultural humility gets a lot closer to the heart of what we do, and so here's what that means to us. When I took that class in grad school, the one about cultural issues in counseling, I assumed that what we were going to be learning in that class was when you were working with somebody from X racial or cultural background, you should expect to see Y characteristics. Instead, we learned about these systems of privilege and oppression, how race impacts people, and we learned that when working with a particular client, that what we should say is something like, I'm aware that in a lot of Asian cultures, it's common to do this thing. Is that your experience? Or, even better and more frequently, I'll say something like, does it feel like there's a cultural component to the family dynamic you're describing? Culture must play a role in the counseling room. It's always present and it must be acknowledged because it impacts how people's experiences are shaped. Harkening back to my 90s education about race, there's a big problem with being colorblind. Rather than trying to explain or describe what this problem is in my own words, I'm going to borrow words from two amazing Black people who said it better than I ever could. First, Ibram X. Kendi, in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, put it so eloquently that it blew my mind. What he said is if you don't see race, then you don't see racism. And second, there's this stunning poem by a Black woman named Pat Parker called For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend. Here are the first two lines. The first thing you do is to forget that I am Black. Second, you must never forget that I am Black. Some of the therapists who work at Through the Woods Therapy Center are themselves people of color. New clients often request to work with those people because they feel safer and more understood by people who they can talk to about their lived experiences without having to worry about needing to educate somebody. Other therapists at Through the Woods, like me, are white, but ultimately, every therapist in our practice recognizes that we have a responsibility to highlight race and culture as a key factor in therapy because it impacts every aspect of our clients' lives. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.